They laughed when you stopped responding. They said you changed. They thought you had given up. But you were not broken. You were preparing. You were watching every move, memorizing every word, and studying every mask that pretended to be loyal. People rarely understand this truth. Silence is not the absence of noise. It is the sharpening of the blade before the strike. When a warrior stops fighting, the world assumes he has fallen, but the wise know he is sharpening his sword in the shadows. You were that warrior. Every insult, every betrayal, every moment of humiliation, you collected it like ammunition. You stopped defending yourself, not because you were weak, but because you finally understood that explaining yourself to blind people only wastes your life. There is a stage in life where arguing becomes meaningless. When you reach that stage, you stop seeking validation. You stop proving your worth. You stop wasting your fire on those who cannot handle your heat. Your silence becomes your rebellion. Your patience becomes your revenge. They thought your distance meant defeat, but distance was your detox. You walked away not because you were scared, but because you were done feeding chaos. You stopped talking not because you had no words, but because your words deserved better ears. That is where true transformation begins. In the quiet hours when you rebuild without witnesses, they will never understand the discipline it takes to remain calm when disrespected. They will never know the strength it takes to remain silent when you have the truth burning in your throat. The weak scream for attention. The powerful wait for results. You chose to wait, and that patience became your greatest weapon. Every empire begins in silence. Before thunder roars, there is stillness in the air. Before victory, there is isolation. You stood in that isolation, molding your pain into precision. You turned heartbreak into hunger. You turned loss into focus. You turned rejection into redirection. That is why your silence was not weakness. It was strategy. When you stopped reacting, you started mastering. Because control is not found in shouting. It is found in the pause between impulse and action. They tested your limits and you did not flinch. That confused them. They tried to provoke you again. They wanted the old version of you, the one who defended, argued, explained, but that version was gone. You had evolved into someone they could no longer manipulate. The day you realized you owed no explanations was the day you became untouchable. You saw through their masks. You noticed how their compliments were traps, how their kindness was currency, how their loyalty was a loan, and instead of exposing them, you smiled and withdrew. That is the move that terrifies manipulators. Quiet withdrawal. Because once you stop reacting, you stop being controlled. You stopped answering every message. You stopped attending every argument. You stopped entertaining every drama. You started valuing your peace more than proving a point. You began to understand that peace is not found in being understood. It is found in being at ease with being misunderstood. That is maturity, choosing not to play the game they expect you to play. Your silence became your sanctuary. You learned to observe without absorbing, to hear without responding, to see without reacting. In that silence you grew dangerous, not because you planned revenge, but because you finally understood your power. You realized that what disturbs you controls you. So you refused to be disturbed, and while they continued their noise, gossiping, judging, mocking, you were busy becoming unrecognizable. You were building yourself quietly, like a storm behind the horizon. The same people who called you silent will one day call you successful. They will rewrite the story and say they always believed in you. Let them. You owe them no correction. Your growth will embarrass their assumptions more than your words ever could. Every master was once mocked for being too quiet. Every visionary was once ignored for not fitting in. Silence is where strength gathers, where discipline matures, where clarity sharpens. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. Power moves without noise. Confidence does not need confirmation. Remember this: silence is not passive. It is preparation. When lions hunt, they do not roar. When eagles fly, they do not announce. When you build, build quietly. Because the loud ones attract envy. The silent ones attract destiny. You have been through storms that tried to drown your spirit, yet you said nothing. You simply adapted. Every trial taught you something speech could not. Every betrayal opened your eyes wider. Every setback was a seed of wisdom buried beneath disappointment. And now those seeds are sprouting into strength. There will come a time when your silence will speak louder than any argument you ever made. When your results will echo through the same walls that once contained your humiliation. When your presence will silence rooms that once whispered about you. That time is near. Because silence always ends in sound, but the sound that follows it is thunder. So do not apologize for going quiet. The world is too loud with nonsense anyway. Let them underestimate you. Let them misinterpret you. Because silence confuses noise. It exposes insecurity. It filters truth. And while they waste energy trying to guess your next move, you will already be 10 steps ahead, moving like a shadow toward your inevitable victory. Your silence is not surrender. It is surveillance. It is strategy. It is power under control. You are not avoiding the fight. You are mastering the battlefield. Word count, 950. There is a kind of silence that breaks weak men. It feels heavy, endless, like a void swallowing every thought. But for those who understand it, that silence becomes a forge, the fire where a new self is crafted. You entered that silence, not because you wanted peace, but because you needed power. You walked away from noise. You hear your own instincts again. And slowly, the chaos in your head began to fade, replaced by something sharper: awareness. People who live on attention cannot survive in silence. They crave reactions the way addicts crave poison. They throw words like daggers, hoping you will bleed enough to respond. But you refuse to give them control over your emotions. You chose to stay still, and that stillness made them restless. Because silence is the mirror that forces people to hear their own lies. Echo back at them. The hardest part of your journey was not the betrayal or the loss. It was the discipline of not reacting. You wanted to scream your truth, to prove your worth, to expose their hypocrisy. But you understood something deeper. Explanation does not change perception. The ones who truly see you do not need proof. The ones who do not will twist every proof into another weapon. So you chose silence, not out of fear, but out of intelligence. The moment you stopped arguing, you started learning. You observed who panicked when you stopped chasing. You saw who disappeared when you stopped pleasing. You discovered who respected you only when you served their comfort. And that discovery hurt, but it was necessary. Silence has a way of stripping illusions. It shows you who deserves your words and who only deserves your absence. You began to understand that noise is a distraction created by the insecure. They cannot sit with themselves, so they project chaos onto others. They need to speak constantly to feel alive. But you learned the art of being alone, without feeling lonely. You discovered that solitude is not emptiness. It is expansion. When the world went quiet, your vision became loud. You started rebuilding yourself, not for validation but for evolution. You trained your mind to respond only to purpose, not provocation. You began waking up earlier, moving with intention, thinking in silence, acting with precision. You realized that discipline is not punishment. It is liberation, because once you can control your impulses, Nobody else can control your direction. The old version of you used to explain every move, defend every decision, justify every emotion. That version died the day you understood that silence is the only response. Arrogance cannot argue with. The more they tried to provoke you, the calmer you became. The more their noise sounded desperate. That is how silence wins, not by confrontation, but by contrast. You learn to love the quiet grunt, the unseen effort, the progress that nobody applauds. Because real transformation does not happen in front of people. It happens in the hours when nobody believes in you, when every door feels locked, when your voice trembles but your heart refuses to quit. You pushed through that phase silently. You trained your mind to turn pain into practice. And every time you stayed silent when you could have reacted, you were lifting invisible weights, strengthening your emotional muscle. That is why silence is not weakness. It is endurance. Only those who have mastered their emotions can sit in silence and smile while being underestimated. The weak need to prove something. The strong wait for the right moment. You waited. You kept moving. You learned how to speak less and do more. You learned that power is not about noise. It is about direction. Silence turned you into a strategy. You stopped showing your progress. You stopped sharing your plans. You stopped explaining your goals. You moved in shadows while others performed in spotlights. You became unpredictable, and unpredictability is the language of power. Because people cannot destroy what they cannot detect. Every insult became instruction. Every doubt became data. You were collecting information while they were wasting emotion. They thought you were quiet because you had no answer. But you were silent because you had already understood everything. You saw the full game, the manipulation, the gossip, the fear behind their arrogance. And instead of fighting noise with noise, you decided to starve it with silence. They say silence kills relationships, but that is only half true. Silence kills manipulation. Silence kills control. Silence kills the false power of those who live off reaction. Because when you do not react, you reclaim your time. You reclaim your energy. You reclaim your mind. Your silence was not just strategy. It was healing. You started noticing the small things again. The calm of mornings. The peace of a clear thought. The strength that comes from not explaining yourself. That peace became addictive. You realized that once you taste solitude, chaos becomes unbearable. You no longer wanted to fight for attention. You wanted to build for legacy. Every empire you admire was built by people who learned to detach from noise, the ones who spoke less and did more. The ones who disappeared before they reappeared as legends. You are in that same phase now. The hidden season of transformation. The world will not clap yet. It will not understand. But silence does not need applause. It only needs time. The best part about silence is how it confuses the enemy. They do not know if you are losing interest or gaining power. They cannot predict your next move because you no longer announce it. They cannot hurt you the same way because you stopped giving them targets. They cannot control you because you no longer react to their triggers. That is the power of being unbothered. It turns you from prey into mystery, and mystery attracts respect. People may not understand you, but they will sense something different. A calm that feels dangerous, because real strength is quiet. Real confidence does not shout. Real power does not perform. It simply exists, untouchable and undeniable. So when they say you changed, smile, because you did. You outgrew the version of yourself that needed to be seen. You outgrew the urge to respond. You became your own audience. You realize that the world never respects the loud ones for long. It bows to the ones who master their silence and turn it into a storm. Word count, 950. At first they thought you disappeared. They assumed you had lost, that your quiet meant surrender. They kept speaking your name, twisting your story, laughing in rooms you were no longer in. But what they did not realize was that silence was your camouflage. You were still there, listening, learning, preparing. You were building power the way roots build beneath the earth. Unseen, unstoppable, inevitable. Silence is the laboratory of kings. Every visionary retreats before he returns. The world forgets you when you go quiet. But that is exactly when you become most dangerous. Because silence is not the end of sound. It is the beginning of control. You had been through the chaos. You had seen how emotion destroys precision. You had learned that people reveal more when you say less. And now your silence had turned into a weapon sharper than any word. They tried to provoke you again. They tried to reopen the doors you had closed. But you did not move. You had mastered the art of restraint. You had learned that nothing disarms an enemy faster than indifference. Their insults began to echo in empty space. Without your reaction, their power evaporated. Because no battle can exist when only one side is fighting. You understood that true victory is not about crushing others. It is about elevating yourself beyond their reach. And that required a silence filled with discipline, purpose, and strategy. You spent that time refining yourself, mind, body, spirit. You studied more. You worked harder. You started turning your pain into production. Every late night became a seed. Every sacrifice became an investment. Every quiet day became a foundation. The world did not see it, but silence was sculpting you into someone who would one day make noise impossible to ignore. There is a saying, revenge is never loud. It is success that walks in quietly and changes the temperature of the room. When you finally re-emerged, you did not need to announce it. Your results did the talking. The same people who once doubted you suddenly fell silent themselves. Because silence is a mirror. And now they saw their reflection clearly. Their arrogance looked small beside your growth. Their gossip sounded meaningless beside your achievements. Your silence had evolved into presence. You no longer needed to explain your worth. You walked into places that once rejected you, and the air shifted. The same eyes that once looked down on you now avoided your gaze. Because power moves differently when it is earned in solitude. You had nothing to prove anymore, only standards to maintain. The truth is, silence changes a person's energy. It makes you aware of details others miss. You start reading people faster, seeing motives before they speak. You develop instincts that words cannot teach. Silence trains your observation until you see patterns in chaos. You begin to predict behaviors, anticipate moves, and stay 10 steps ahead without saying a word. That is why silence is feared. It reveals without revealing. People started to notice. They could not explain your calmness, your control, your unshakable confidence. They called it mystery, but it was mastery. You had mastered the only battlefield that matters, your mind. And once you master that, every external storm becomes irrelevant. You no longer feared loss. You no longer needed applause. You no longer chased validation. You had detached from noise, and that detachment made you invincible. The loud seek attention. The silent command respect. You became the kind of person who could walk into a room and shift the energy without saying a word. That is what silence does. It creates gravity. It makes people lean in. It turns presence into pressure. Because silence, when earned, carries authority. It is not about pretending to be calm. It is about becoming calm. You began to notice how peace felt more powerful than any argument. You stopped chasing closure because peace itself became closure. You no longer needed to win every conversation. Your growth became the proof. You realize that silence is not the absence of response, it is the presence of self-control. And self-control is the highest form of power. Your old enemies started watching you differently. The ones who mocked your silence now feared your stillness. They could not read you anymore. They could not access you. Because once you rise above their frequency, they cannot hear you and you cannot hear them. That is what silence does. It separates the powerful from the predictable. You no longer needed to be understood. You only needed to keep evolving. You started surrounding yourself with people who valued peace over performance, growth over gossip, focus over noise. And suddenly, your silence no longer felt lonely, it felt sacred. You were no longer avoiding people. You were protecting your vibration. You were guarding your focus. You were conserving your energy for creation, not confrontation. Every time you stayed silent when someone tried to provoke you, you rewrote your destiny. Because silence is a decision. To rise instead of react, to build instead of battle, to create instead of complain. You chose to invest that energy in your vision, and that decision transformed everything. The discipline that once felt like isolation had turned into liberation. You were free from their control, free from their noise, free from their narrative. Now when they see you, they do not know what to say. Your silence has rewritten your story. They can no longer define you, because you no longer defend yourself. You have become proof that silence is not emptiness. It is evolution. Every empire, every legend, every great name in history mastered the art of quiet progress. Before the world noticed their noise, you are walking that same path. So remember this: silence is not the absence of power, it is power in its purest form. It is the art of being patient in the storm, precise in the plan, and unstoppable in the outcome. You do not owe explanations to those who misunderstand your silence. Let them guess, let them wonder, let them talk, because while they speak, you will continue to move. Quietly, effectively, relentlessly. Your silence was never weakness. It was strategy, it was survival, it was self-mastery, and now it has become your signature. The calm before your storm has ended. The storm is here, and it has your name written on it. Subscribe for more. Your transformation has only begun.